To what extent does resoluteness, thought out to its end, in accordance with its almost tendency of being, lead us to authentic being toward it? How is the connection between wanting to have a conscience and the existentially projected, authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein to be conceived? Does welding the two together result in a new phenomenon? Or are we left with the resoluteness, attested to in its existential possibility, in such a way that it can undergo an existential anodalization through being toward death? But what does it mean to think through to the end, the phenomenon of resoluteness existentially? Resoluteness was characterized as the reticent self-projecting upon one's almost being guilty, and as demanding anxiety of oneself. Being guilty belongs to Dasein and means, null being the ground of a nullity. The guilty, that belongs to the being of Dasein, admits neither of increase nor decrease. It lies before all quantification, if the latter has any meaning at all. Being essentially guilty, Dasein is not just guilty occasionally and other times not. Wanting to have a conscience resolves itself for this being guilty. The intrinsic sense of resoluteness is to project upon itself this being guilty that Dasein is as long as it is. Taking over this guilt, existentially resoluteness occurs authentically only if, in its disclosing of Dasein, resoluteness has become so transparent that it understands being guilty as something constant. But this understanding is made possible only in such a way that Dasein discloses to itself its potentiality of being up to its end. The being at an end of Dasein, however, means existentially being toward the end. Resoluteness becomes authentically what it can be as being toward theme that understands, that is, as anticipation of death. Resoluteness does not simply have a connection with anticipation as something other than itself. It harbors in itself authentic being toward death as the possible existential modality of its own authenticity. You want now to clarify this connection phenomenally. Resoluteness means letting oneself be called forth to one's almost being guilty. Being guilty belongs to the being of Dasein itself, which we define primarily as potentiality of being. The statement that Dasein is constantly guilty can only mean that it always maintains itself in this being either as authentic or inauthentic existence. Being guilty is not just a lasting quality of something constantly objectively present, but the existential possibility of being authentically or inauthentically guilty. Guilty is always only in the actual factical potentiality of being. Thus, being guilty must be conceived as a potentiality for being guilty, because it belongs to the being of Dasein. Resoluteness projects itself upon this potentiality of being, that is, understands itself in it. Thus, this understanding maintains itself in a primordial possibility of Dasein. It stays in it authentically when resoluteness is primordially what it tends to be. But we revealed the primordial being of Dasein toward its potentiality of being as being toward death, that is, toward that which we characterized as the imminent possibility of Dasein. Anticipation disclosed this possibility as possibility. Thus, resoluteness becomes a primordial being toward the almost potentiality of being of Dasein only as anticipatory. Resoluteness understands the ken of its potentiality for being guilty only when it qualifies itself as being toward death. Resolutely, Dasein takes over authentically in its existence the fact that it is the null ground of its nullity. We conceived of death existentially as what we characterized as the possibility of the impossibility of existence, that is, as the absolute nothingness of Dasein. Death is not tacked onto Dasein as its end, but as care, Dasein is the throne that is null ground of its death. The nothingness primordially dominant in the being of Dasein is revealed to it in authentic being toward death. Anticipation makes being guilty evident only on the basis of the whole being of Dasein. Care contains death and guilt equiprimordially. Only anticipatory resoluteness understands the potentiality for being guilty authentically and wholly, that is, primordially. Understanding the call of conscience reveals the lostness in the they. Resoluteness brings Dasein back to its almost potentiality of being a self. One's own potentiality of being becomes authentic and transparent in the understanding being toward death as one's own enos possibility. The call of conscience passes over all worldly status and abilities of Dasein in its summit. It uncompromisingly individualizes Dasein down to its potentiality for being guilty, which it expects it to be authentic. The relentless severity with which Dasein is thus essentially individualized down to its almost potentiality of being discloses anticipation of death as the possibility which is non-relational. Anticipatory resoluteness lets the potentiality for being guilty, as its almost non-relational possibility, completely drive into its conscience. Wanting to have a conscience signifies the readiness for the summons to one's almost being guilty, that always already determined factical Dasein before any factical indebtedness, and after that indebtedness has been settled. This prior and constant being guilty, which is constantly with us, does not show itself without being covered over in its character as prior, until that priority is placed in the possibility which is, for Dasein, absolutely insuperable, unüberholbar. When resoluteness, anticipating, has caught up with the possibility of death and its potentiality of being, the authentic existence of Dasein can no longer be overtaken überholt by anything. With the phenomenon of resoluteness, we were led to the primordial truth of existence. Resolute, Dasein is revealed to itself in its actual factical potentiality of being, in such a way that it itself is this revealing and being revealed. To any truth, there belongs a corresponding holding for true. The explicit appropriation of what is disclosed or discovered is being certain. The primordial truth of existence requires an equiprimordial being certain, in which one holds oneself in what resoluteness discloses. It gives itself the actual factical situation, and brings itself into that situation. The situation cannot be calculated in advance, and pregiven like something objectively present waiting to be grasped. It is disclosed only in a free act of resolve that has not been determined beforehand, but is open to the possibility of such determination. What then does the certainty belonging to such resoluteness mean? This certainty must hold itself in what is disclosed in resolution. But this means that it simply cannot become rigid about the situation, but must understand that the resolution must be kept free and open for the actual factical possibility, in accordance with its own meaning as a disclosure. The certainty of the resolution means keeping oneself free for the possibility of taking it back, a possibility that is always factically necessary. This holding for true in resoluteness, as the truth of existence, however, by no means lets us fall back into irresoluteness. On the contrary, this holding for true, as a resolute holding oneself free for taking back, is the authentic resoluteness to repeat itself. But thus one's very lostness in irresoluteness is existentially undermined. The holding for true that belongs to resoluteness tends, in accordance with its meaning, toward constantly keeping oneself free, that is, to keep itself free for the whole potentiality of being of Dasein. This constant certainty is guaranteed to resoluteness only in such a way that it relates to that possibility of which it can be absolutely certain. In its death, Dasein must absolutely take itself back. Constantly certain of this, that is, anticipating, resoluteness gains its authentic and whole certainty. But Dasein is equiprimordially an untruth. Anticipatory resoluteness at the same time gives Dasein the primordial certainty of its being closed off. In anticipatory resoluteness, Dasein holds itself open for its constant lostness in the irresoluteness of the lostness which is possible from the very ground of its own being. As a constant possibility of Dasein, irresoluteness is co-cert. Resoluteness, transparent to itself, understands that the indefiniteness of its potentiality of being is always determined only in a resolution with regard to the actual situation. It knows about the indefiniteness that prevails in a being that exists. But this knowledge must itself arise from an authentic disclosure, if it is to correspond to authentic resoluteness. Although it always becomes certain in resolution, the indefiniteness of one's own potentiality of being, however, always reveals itself completely only in being toward death. Anticipation brings Dasein face to face with a possibility that is constantly certain, and yet remains indefinite at every moment as to when possibility becomes impossibility. Anticipation makes manifest that this being has been thrown into the indefiniteness of its limit situation. Resolved upon this, Dasein attains its authentic potentiality of being whole. The indefiniteness of death discloses itself primordially in anxiety. But this primordial anxiety strives to expect resoluteness of itself. It clears away every covering over of the fact that Dasein is itself left to itself. The nothingness before which anxiety brings us reveals the nullity that determines Dasein in its ground, which itself is as thrownness into death. Our analysis revealed in order the moments of modalization toward which resoluteness tends of itself, and which stem from authentic being toward death as the almost, non-relational, insuperable, certain, and yet indefinite possibility. It is authentically and completely what it can be only as anticipatory resoluteness. But on the other hand, our interpretation of the connection between resoluteness and anticipation first attained the complete existential understanding of anticipation itself. Till now, it was valid only as an ontological projection. Now we see that anticipation is not a fictitious possibility that we have forced upon Dasein, but rather the mode of a potentiality of being existentially attested to in Dasein, which it demands of itself, if indeed it authentically understands itself as resolute. Anticipation is not some kind of unattached behavior, but must rather be conceived of as the possibility of the authenticity of that resoluteness existentially attested to in such resoluteness a possibility concealed, and thus also attested. Authentic thinking about death is wanting to have a conscience, which has become existentially transparent to itself. If resoluteness, as authentic, tends toward the mode delimited by anticipation, and if anticipation constitutes the authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein, then in resoluteness which is existentially attested to there is co-attested to an authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein. The question of the potentiality of being whole is a factical, existential one. It is answered by Dasein as resolute. The question of the potentiality of being whole of Dasein has now completely cast off the character, which we initially pointed out when we treated it as if it were just a theoretical, methodological question of the analytic of Dasein, arising from the attempt to have the whole of Dasein completely given. The question of the wholeness of Dasein, initially discussed only with regard to ontological method, has its justification, but only because the ground for that justification goes back to an ontic possibility of Dasein. Our clarification of the connection between anticipation and resoluteness, in the sense of a possible modalization of resoluteness by anticipation, turned into the phenomenal demonstration of an authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein. If with this phenomenon a mode of being of Dasein has been grasped in which it brings itself to and before itself, it must remain ontically and ontologically unintelligible to the everyday, common-sense interpretation of Dasein by the they. It would be a misunderstanding to put this existential possibility aside as being unproven, or to want to prove it theoretically. Nevertheless, the phenomenon must be shielded from the crudest distortion. Anticipatory resoluteness is not a way out fabricated for the purpose of overcoming death, but it is rather the understanding that follows the call of conscience, and that frees for death the possibility of gaining power over the existence of Dasein, and of fundamentally dispersing every fugitive self-covering over. Nor does wanting to have a conscience, which we defined as being toward death, mean a detachment in which one flees from the world, but brings one without illusions to the resoluteness of act. Nor does anticipatory resoluteness stem from idealistic expectation soaring above existence and its possibilities, but arises from the sober understanding of the basic factical possibilities of Dasein. Together with the sober anxiety that brings us before our individualized potentiality of being, goes the unshakable joy in this possibility. In it, Dasein becomes free of the entertaining incidentals that busy curiosity provides for itself, primarily in terms of the events of the world. However, the analysis of these fundamental moods goes beyond the limits drawn for our present inquiry by aiming toward fundamental ontology. But does not a definite ontic interpretation of authentic existence, a factical ideal of Dasein, underlie our ontological interpretation of the existence of Dasein? Indeed, but not only is this fact one that must not be denied and that we are forced to concede, it must be understood in its positive necessity, in terms of the thematic object of our inquiry. Philosophy will never seek to deny its presuppositions, but neither may it merely admit them. It conceives them and develops with more and more penetration both the presuppositions themselves and that for which they are presupposition. This is the function that the methodological considerations now demanded of us have.